So, welcome in my reading branch. Let's continue a pilgrimage to that place. We ended up on talking about the story of that guy, where the French were charging. A cavalry charge was something beyond Cassad's experience, or Cassad. Watching 1,200 armored horses charging directly at him created internal sensation which Cassad found a bit unnerving. The charge took less than 40 seconds, but Cassad discovered that this was ample time for his mouth to go absolutely dry, his breathing to begin to have problems, and for his testicles to retreat completely into his body. If the rest of Cassad could have found a comparable hiding place, he would have seriously considered crawling into it. As it was, he was too busy to run. Firing on command, his line of archers got off 5 flat volleys at the attacking horsemen, managed one more shot in independent fire, and then they fell back 5 paces. Horses, it turned out, were too smart to willingly impale themselves upon stakes, no matter how hard the human riders implored them to do so. But the second and third waves of cavalry did not stop as abruptly as the first, and in the single mad moment horses were down and screaming, riders were throwing and screaming, and Cassad was out and screaming, rushing at every downed Frenchman he could see, wielding a mallet on the prostrate form when he could, slashing through gaps of armor with his long knife when it was too crowded to swing the mallet. Soon he and the grizzled archer and the younger man who had lost his cap became an efficient killing team, closing in on downed river from 3 sides, Cassad using the mallet to knock the pleading horsemen off his knees, all 3 moving in with their blades. Then all 3 moving in with their blades. Only one man gained his feet and raised a sword to confront them. The Frenchman flipped up his visor and called out a clear request for a honor in single combat. The old man and the young circled like wolves. Cassad returned with his bow and put an arrow into a knife's left eye from 10 paces. The battle continued in the deadly comic opera, vain common to all armed combat signs, the first rock and tribune duels on old earth. The French cavalry managed to turn and flee just as the first wave of 10,000 men at arms charged the English centre on foot. The melee broke up the rhyme of the attack, and the time the French had regained their initiative. Henry's own men at arms had braced to hold them at pike length, while Cassad and several thousand other archers poured volley fire into the massed French infantry at close range. They did not end the battle. It was not necessarily even the decisive moment. The turning point where it came was lost, as all such moments are, within the dust and turmoil of 1,000 individual encounters where infantrymen faced infantrymen across the distance of their personal weapons. Before it was over, some 3 hours later, there would be minor variations on repeated themes, ineffective thrust and clumsy counter-thrust, and a less than honorable moment when Henry would order prisoners killed rather than leave them in the rear where the English were confronted with a new threat. but the heralds and historians would later agree that the outcome had been sealed somewhere in the confusion during the first French infantry charge. The French died in their thousands. English dominion on that part of the continent would continue for a while. The day of the armored men at arms, the night, the embodiment of chivalry was over, hammered into history coffin by a few thousand ragtag peasant archers carrying longbows. The ultimate insult to the noble-born French dead. If the dead indeed could be further insulted, lay in the fact that the English archers were not only common men, common in the lowest, most flea-infested sense of the word, but they were drafties, dagged boys, GIs, grunts, APs, species, K-techs, jump rats. But all that was in the lesson Cassad was supposed to have learned during the OCS HTN exercise. He learned none of it. He was too busy having an encounter which would consider his life. The French man-at-arms went over the head of his falling horse, rolled once, and was up and running for the woods before the mud quit flying. Cassad followed. He was halfway to the tree line before he realized that the youth and the grizzled archer had not come with him. It did not matter. Cassad's adrenaline was flowing and the bloodlust had him in its grip. The man-at-arms, who had been just thrown to the ground from a horse moving at full gallop and who was wearing 60 pounds of clumsy armor, should have been an easy prey to catch. He was not. The Frenchman glanced back once, saw Cassad coming on at a full run with a mallet in his hand and his eye full of business. Busyness? And then the man-at-arms shifted into a high gear and reached the 315 meters ahead of his pulsar. Cassad was deep into the woods before he stopped, leaned on the mallet, gasped and considered his position. Thuds, screams and crashes from the battlefield behind him were muffled by the distance and shrubbery. The trees were almost bare and still dripped from a rainstorm the night before. The floor of the forest was carpeted with a thick layer of old leaves and a snarl of thubs, shrubs and brambles. The man-at-arms had left a trail of broken branches and footprints for the first 20 meters or so, but non-deer trails and overgrown path made it difficult to see where he had passed. Cassad moved slowly, stepping deeper into the woods, trying to be alert for any noise above the sound of his own panting and the insane pounding of his heart. It occurred to Cassad that, technically speaking, it was not a brilliant move. The man-at-arms had been wearing full armor and carrying his sword when he disappeared in the bushes. At any moment the Frenchman might forget his panic, regret his temporary loss of honor, and remembered his years of combat training. Cassad also had been trained. He looked down at his cloth shirt and leather vest. The mallet was still in his hand, the knife in his broad belt. He had been trained to use high-energy weapons with a killing range of a few meters to thousands of kilometers. He had been rated in plasma grenades, hell whips, flechette rifles, sonics, recoilless zero-gravity weapons, death ones, kinetic assault guns, and beam gauntlets. He now had a working knowledge of an English longbow. None of these objects, including the longbow, was on his person at the moment. "Oh, shit," mumbled Second Lieutenant Cassad. The man-at-arms came out of the bushes like a charging bear, arms up, legs apart, the sword coming around in a flat arc meant to disembowel Cassad. The OC's cadet tried to leap back and raise his mallet at the same time. Neither effort was completely successful. The Frenchman's sword knocked the heavy mallet out of Cassad's grip, while the dull point of the blade slashed through the leather, shirt and skin. Cassad bellowed and stumbled backwards again, tugged at the knife in his belt. His right heel caught the branch of a fallen tree, and he went down backwards, cursing and rolling deeper into the tangle of branches as the man-at-arms crashed forwards, his heavy sword clearing limbs like an oversized machete. Cassad had his knife out by the time the man-at-arms had cleared a path through the deadfall, but the 10-inch blade was a pitiful thing against armor unless the knight was helpless. This knight was not helpless. Cassad knew that he would never get inside the arc of sword blade. His only hope was in running. But the tall trunk of the fallen tree behind him and the deadfall beyond eliminated that option. He did not wish to get cut down from behind as he turned, nor from below as he climbed. Cassad did not wish to be cut down from any angle. Cassad went into a knife fighter crouch which he hasn't used since his street fighting days in the Tharsis slums. He wondered how the simulation would deal with his death. The figure appeared behind the man-at-arms like a sudden shadow. The noise of Cassad's mallet striking the knight's armored shoulder sounded precisely like someone bashing the hood of an EMV with a sledgehammer. The Frenchman staggered, turned to meet the new threat, and took a second mallet below in the chest. Cassad's sabre was small. The man-at-arms did not go down. Cassad's sabre was small. The man-at-arms did not go down. The French knight was raising his swords above his head when Cassad hit him behind and below the knees with a shoulder knuckle. 3 limbs snapped as the Frenchman went down. The small attacker stood aside the knight, pinning the armored man's sword arm with one foot while bringing the mallet down repeatedly onto helmet and visor. Cassad extracted himself from the tangle of legs and branches, sat on the downed man's knee, and began slashing through gaps in armor at groins, sides, and underarms. Cassad's rescuer jumped aside to plant both feet and the knight's wrist, and Cassad scrambled forward, stabbing through crevices where the helmet met chest armor, finally slamming the blade through slits in the visor itself. The knight screamed as the mallet came down a final time. Almost catching Cassad's hand in the hammer drove the blade through the visor, slit like a 10-inch tent peg. The man-at-arms arched, lifting Cassad's and 60 pounds of armor clear of the ground in a final violent spasm, and then fell back limply. Cassad rolled onto his side. His rescuer collapsed beside him. Both were covered with sweat and dead man's blood. Cassad looked at his savior. The woman was dressed in clothes not dissimilar to Cassad's. For a moment they merely lay there and gasped for air. "Are you all right?" Cassad managed after a while. He was suddenly struck by her appearance. Her brown hair was short by current World Web fashion, short and straight, and cut so the longest strands fell from the part, just a few centimeters left of the center of her forehead, to just above her right ear. It was a boy's haircut from some forgotten time, but she was not a boy. Cassad thought that she was perhaps the most beautiful woman he had ever seen. Bone structure so perfect that chin and cheekbones were shaped without being too sharp, large eyes glowing with life and intelligence, a gentle mouth with a soft underlip. Lying next to her, Cassad realized that she was tall, not so tall as he, but obviously not a woman from the 15th century. And even under her loose tunic and boggy trousers, he could see the soft swell of hips and breast. She appeared to be a few years older than Cassad, perhaps in her late 20s, but this fact barely registered as she continued staring into his face with those soft, beguiling, endlessly deep eyes. "Are you all right?" he asked again. His voice sounded strange, even to himself. She did not answer, or rather she answered by sliding long fingers across Cassad's chest, ripping away the leather thongs which bounded the rough vest. Her hands found his shirt. It was soaked with blood and ripped halfway down the front. The woman ripped it open the rest of the way. She moved against him now, her fingers and lips on his chest, hips already beginning to move. Her right hand found the cords to his trousers front, ripped them free. Cassad helped her pull off the rest of his clothes, removed hers, removed hers with three fluid movements. She wore nothing under her shirt and coarse cloth trousers. Cassad's hand slid between her tights behind her, cupped her moving buttocks, pulled her closer, and slid to the moist roughness in front. She opened to him, her mouth closing on his. Somehow, with all of their motion and disrobing, their skin never lost contact. Cassad felt his own excitement rubbing against the cusp of her belly. She rolled above him then, her tights astride his hips, her gaze still locked with his. Cassad had never been so excited. He gasped at her right hand, with behind her, found him, guided him into her. When he opened his eyes again, she was moving slowly, her head back, eyes closed. Cassad's hand moved up her sides to cup her perfect breasts. Nipples hardened against his palms. They made love then. Cassad, at 23 standard years, had been in love once and had enjoyed sex many times. He thought he knew the way and the whole way of it. There was nothing in his experience to that moment which he could not have described with a phrase and a laugh to his squadmates in the hold of a troop transport. With the calm, sure cynism of a 23-year-old veteran, he was sure that he would never experience anything that could not be so described, so dismissed. He was wrong. He could never adequately share the sense of the next few minutes with anyone else. He would never try. They made love in a sudden shaft of late October light, with a carpet of leaves and clouds beneath them, and a film of blood and sweat oiling the sweet friction between them. Her green eyes stared down at Cassad, widening slightly when he began moving quickly, closing at the same second he closed his. They moved together, then in the sudden tide of sensation, as old and inevitable as the movement of worlds, pulses racing, flesh quickening with its own moist purposes, a further renal raising together, the world receding to nothing at all, and then, still joined by touch and heartbeat and the fading thrill of passion, allowing consciousness to slide back to separate flesh while the world flew in through forgotten senses. They lay next to each other. The dead man's armor was cold against Cassad's left arm, her thigh warm against his right leg. The sunlight was a benediction. Hidden colors rose to the sun face of things. Kassad turned his head and gazed at her as she rested her head on his shoulder. Her cheeks glowed with flush and autumn light, and her hair laid like copper threads along the flesh of his arm. She curved her leg over his thigh, and Kassad felt the clockwise string stirring of renewal passion. The sun was warm on his face. He closed his eyes. When he awoke, she was gone. He was certain that only seconds had passed. He was certain that only seconds had passed, no more than a minute certainly. But the sunlight was gone. Colors had flowed out of the forest, and a cool evening breeze moved bare branches. Kassad, dressed in torn clothes, made stiff with blood. The French man at arms lay still and rigid in the unself-conscious attitude of death. The already seemed initiative a part of the forest. There was no sign whatsoever of the woman. Fedman Kassad limped his way back through the woods, evening gloom and a sudden chilling drizzle. The battlefield still held people, living and dead. The dead lay in heaps like the piles of toy soldiers Kassad had played with as a child. Wounded men have moved slowly with the help of friends. Here and there furtive forms picked their way among the dead, and near the opposite tree line a lively group of heralds, both French and English, met in conclave with much pointing and animated conversation. Kassad knew that they had to decide upon the name of the battle so that their respective records would agree. He also knew that they would settle on the name of the nearest castle, Agincourt, even though it had figured in neither strategy nor battle. Kassad was beginning to think that it was no simulation, that his life in the world web was the dream, and that this great day had to be reality, when suddenly the entire scene froze with outlines of human figures, horses, and the darkening forest becoming as transparent as fading halo. And then Kassad was being helped out of his simulation crate at the Olympus Command School, and the other cadets and instructors were rising, talking, laughing with one another, all seemingly unaware that the world had changed forever. For weeks Kassad spent every 3 hours wandering in the command school grounds, watching from the ramparts as the evening shadows of Moon's Olympus covered first of the plateau forest, then the heavily settled highlands, then everything halfway to the horizon, and then all the world. And every school he thought about what had happened. He thought about her. No one else had noticed anything strange in the simulation. No one else had left the battlefield. One instructor explained that nothing beyond the battlefield exists in that particular segment of the simulation. No one had missed Kassad. It was as the incident of the forest, and the woman had never happened. Kassad knew better. He attended his classes on military history and mathematics. He put in his hours at the firing range and gym. He walked off barracks punishment on the Caldera quadrangle. Although these were rare, in general, young Kassad became an even more excellent officer cadet than he had been. But all the while he waited. And she came again, and then she came again. Again, it was the final hours of an OCC HDN simulation. By then, Kassad had learned that the exercises were something more than the more than mere simulations. The OCHTN was a part of the World Web All Thing, the real-time network which governed hegemony politics, fed information to tens of billions of data-hungry citizens, and had evolved a form of autonomy and consciousness all its own. More than 150 planetary data spheres mingled their resources within the framework created by 6,000 Omega-class AIs to allow the OCS HDN to function. The HDN staff doesn't simulate, whitened Cadet Redinsky, the best AI expert Kassad could find and bribe to explain. It dreams with the best historical accuracy in the web, way beyond the sum of its parts, because it plugs in holistic insights as well as facts, and when it dreams, it lets us dreams with it. Kassad had not understood, but he had believed, and then she came again. In the first US-Vietnam War, they made love in the aftermath of an ambush during the darkness and terror of a night patrol. Kassad wore rough camouflage clothes, with no underwear because of the jungle crotch rot, and a steel helmet not much more advanced than those at Agincourt. She wore black pajamas and sandals, the universal garb of the Southeast Asian peasant, and the Viet Cong. Then neither of them wore anything as they made love standing in the night, her back against a tree and her legs wrapped around him, while beyond them the world exploded in the green glow of perimeter flares and the sputter crack of claymores. She came to him on the second day of Gettysburg and again at Borodino, where the clouds of powdered smoke hung above the piles of bodies like a vapor congealed from departing souls. They made love in the shattered hulk of the APC in Hellas Basin, while the hover tank battle still raged, and the red dust of the approaching Simoon scraped and shrieked at the titanium hull. "Tell me your name," he had whispered in standard. She shook her head. "Are you real outside the simulation?" he asked in the Japanese English of that era. She had nodded and leaned closer to kiss him. They lay together in a sheltered place among the ruins of Basilia, while dead beams from Chinese MEVs played like blue searchlights on the broken ceramic walls. During an unnamed battle after a siege of a forgotten tower city on the Russian steppes, he pulled her back into the shattered room where they had made love, and he whispered, "I want to stay with you." She touches his lips with a finger and shook her head. After the evacuation of New Chicago, as they lay on the 100th floor balcony where Kassad had set his sniper's nest for the last US presidential hopeless rearguard action, United States President's hopeless rearguard action, he placed his hand on the warm flesh between her breasts and said, "Can you ever join me out there?" She touched his cheek with her palm and smiled. During the last year in command school, there were only 5 OCS HDN simulations at the cadet training ship, I think, on that story. And then she did not come again, and there was not even dreaming as the young officer forecast the Earth's moon for the Masada ceremony. Forecast again to Tau Ceti Center for their formal swearing into the force, and then they were finished. Second Lieutenant Canon Kassad became Lieutenant Kassad. spent 3 standard weeks free in the web with the Force-issued universal card, which allowed him to forecast as far as frequently as he wished, and then he was shipped out to the Hegemony Colonial Service Training School on Lucas to prepare for active duty beyond the web. He was sure that he would never see her again. He was wrong. Feldman Kassad had grown up into a culture of poverty and sudden death. As a member of a minority who still called themselves Palestinians, he and his family had lived in the slums of Tarsis, human testimony to the bitter legacy of the terminally dispossessed. Every Palestinian in the world web and beyond carried the cultural memory of the century of struggle caped by a month of nationalism triumph before the nuclear jihad of 2038 wiped it all away. Then came their secondary diaspora, this one lasting 5 centuries and leading to death and desert world like Mars. Their dream buried with the death of the old Earth. Kassad, like the older boys of the South Tarsis, relocation camps, either ran with gangs or faced their option to being prey to every self-proclaimed predator in the camps. He chose to run with the gangs. Kassad had killed another youth by the time he was 16 standard years old. If Mars was known for anything in the world web, it was for hunting in the Marinary Valley, Schroeder's Zen Massif in Halas Basin, and the Olympus Command School. Kassad did not have to travel to Mariner Valley to learn about hunting and begin hunted. He had to interest in Zen Gnosticism, and as a teenager he felt nothing but contempt for the uniformed cadets who came from every part of the web to train for Force. He joined with his peers in sneering at the new Bushido as a code for faggots. But an ancient vein of honor in the young Kassad school secretly resonated to the thugs of a samurai class, whose life and work were evolved around duty, self-respect, and ultimate value of one's world. When Kassad was 18, a Tharedis province higher circuit judge offered him the choice of a Marinian year at the Polar War camp or volunteering for the John Carter Brigade, then forming to help Force put down the resurgent Genon High Rebellion in the Class 3 colonies. Kassad volunteered and discovered that he enjoyed the discipline and cleanliness of military life. Even through the Joint Carter Brigade saw only garrison duty within the web and was dissolved shortly after Genon's closed grandson died on Resistance. Renaissance. 2 days after his 19th birthday, Kassad applied for Force ground, and was turned down. He went on a 9-day drunk walk in one of the deeper 5 tunnels of Lusus with his military comlock implant stolen by someone who apparently had taken a correspondence course in surgery, his universal card and forecaster access revoked, and his head exploding 5 frontiers of pain. Kassad worked on Lusus for a standard year, so saving over 6,000 marks and allowing physical labor in the 1-3 Ise gravity to put an end to his martial frailness. But the time he used his savings to ship out the Mayu Covenant on an ancient solar sail frigate with the jury-rigged halving drives. Kassad was still lean and tall by web standards, but that muscles were worked wonderfully well by anyone's standard. By arrived on Mari Century 3 wards, day before the vicious and unpopular island war began there, and eventually the Force Combined commanded at Fireside, at Fireside, got so tired of seeing the young Cassads waiting in his outer office that he allowed the boy to enlist in the 23rd Supply Regiment and as assignment hydrofoil driver. 11 standard months later, Corporal Cassad of the 12th Mobile Infantry Battalion had received 2 distinguished service clusters, a Senate complementation for a Valor in the Equator Archipelago Complaint, and 2 Purple Hearts. He was also tapped for Force Command School and shipped webwards on the next convoy. I will stop here. Thank you for reading and see you tomorrow.